Okay, so in this section, we're going to take a look at specific examples of blasting. There are some different techniques that you might use in situations like this. We also have a different song with some different recorded drums that presents its own challenges and might alter our workflow. So let's take a look at these files. We have no natural recorded kick drum on this. That's not an uncommon thing for death metal in general, or specifically kind of technical death metal. It sounds like maybe these kick drums were heavily muted with the idea of only using the triggered sound. And I know that because we don't really have a lot of bleed in the overheads from the kick drum. So that actually opens up some possibilities for us. Let's hear this. Well, I'll tell you right now, I have some trigger, an instance of trigger on these kick triggers, just so we can listen to that instead of listening to, no one wants to hear that. So I have a sound for us. And let's go ahead and go through these parts, and I'll talk about the different blast beats and maybe the challenges that they might bring. Okay, so this is what is sometimes referred to as a bomb blast or a downbeat blast. We have snares on the downbeat on an eighth note, and double bass kick in between, essentially what should be doing 16th notes, so double timing the snare. It looks like we don't have the most consistent bass drum here. There's 5 hits in this chunk. There should only be 4. There's 4 here. There's 4 here. He kind of gets into a groove, but it's not real solid. We're going to probably end up scrapping a lot of this initial kick drum performance and kind of drawing that in with MIDI after the fact. Let's take a look at this next section before we get started. Okay, another kind of changing target on us. So after this fill here, we get into a split foot blast. It sounds like possibly he's doing left-right kick there. It's also a black metal blast, or called hand over foot blast. In this blast, the right hand is locked in with the kick drum on the downbeats, and the snares are on the upbeats. Together they make a 16th note pattern in this particular instance. So you can see again that kicks are pretty close, but they're kind of swaying a little bit. What we're going to want to more focus on here would be the hi-hat and the snare drum. And those crashes. Hi-hat and crashes need to be on downbeats. The snare drum needs to be on upbeats. Towards the end of these segments, he switches to a downbeat blast. So that's a tricky thing, and it's only mildly apparent in this particular take. We're going to want to make that more apparent, bring him right on the grid, essentially, in this case, and give this a nice tight performance. Okay, so since we have no natural kick to worry about, we don't have a lot of bleed in the overheads, we're able to kind of treat them separately. So for the time being, I'm going to actually go ahead and mute the kick drum. We're still going to keep it locked together with the rest of the kit because we're going to want to use it in situations like this. Other areas of the song, he might be playing more standard beats where we're going to want to keep that kick drum performance. But for these blasts, since they're kind of out of whack anyway, we're just going to end up recreating those with MIDI notes after the fact. So let's get started on this first section, which is going to be the easier of the two. We just have eighth note snare drums. They're supposed to be right on the beat, and hopefully this hi-hat is lining up for the most part, and then a little fill at the end. So I've already created some hit points for these sections. Not much changes from how we did it for the initial metal editing that we did. So we're going to kind of skip that part and go right to the quantize panel. Since we're essentially ignoring kick drum, there is no kick drum here because I didn't make hit points for it. So we're going to leave the snare at 4, and the toms can just be a 3 just underneath. Go ahead and make our slices. Now let's see how lucky we get if we pick all of these. Make sure 8th notes is selected since that's our time base here. And let's, since we're trying to get these real tight, let's jump up to 90%. Quantize. Okay, so it looks like we may be in a pretty good spot. Okay, this last fill is a 16th note fill, so let's jump up to 16th notes, quantize again, and see what work we need to do. There's enough kind of screwed up here that I think we're going to have better luck if we just do this part by hand. So we're going to reset, go ahead and quantize. That'll just get our first hit on point. And we'll take care of that by hand. The rest of that stuff sounded good, so as long as it makes it through crossfades all right, then we don't have much to worry about. Let's take a look. So it's kind of tough to see this 3rd hit, but I think it's about there and here. That one's not too far out. Click here. Bring these back. So rather than clicking and dragging now, I'll occasionally just make my cut. This part's already highlighted, and I just hit Q, and it'll kind of snap it where it needs to go. So you sort of have both options. If you're looking to go just right on the grid, sometimes it's quicker to just, you can even do it a few at a time. Make your cuts. Select them all, quantize them right into place. This guy will just drag. Oops, just you. Drag over and clean up that tail. Let's listen to that. Sounds good to me. Select all, crossfade. Okay, I did hear one spot that sounded like maybe the hi-hat lagged just a hair. Let's see if we can find that. It's that guy right there. You can sort of see it. The hi-hat isn't quite as clear, but I'm gonna see if maybe we can just scoot it forward a bit. It's gonna put this snare a tiny bit ahead, but maybe split the difference and make it so we don't notice that quite as much. Yeah, I think that sounds smoother to me. Cool. Grab everything, bounce it. And I realized that we still have kick muted, but for now, we're done with that section. This next part was from the same song, so eventually we would get there, and we may have to tackle this in a slightly different manner. Let's again refresh ourselves with what we're dealing with here. Okay, so these snares are supposed to be on the upbeat, not the downbeat. It's not super apparent, and we have some hi-hat to take care of, and it may be difficult to see exactly where those transients are, so we're gonna have to use a combination of our visual tools and our ears and get things as close as they can, close as we can get them. So he's on his X-hat here, and we can actually see these hits pretty good. He's double timing that, but there's definitely a swing to it, so those downbeats are a lot stronger. So again, we're gonna leave the kicks muted and just not be distracted by those at this point, and take care of the snare and cymbals at this stage. Okay, select. I've made my hit points already. Let's pull these into some sort of order and make our slices. Now, since we're dealing with snares on the upbeats, we're actually looking at 16th notes because the hi-hats are going to land on the 1 and the snare should be landing on the 2. This can get messy, so you're going to have to bear with me and we'll get through it, but these types of sections aren't fun. Drum editing, none of it is really fun. Cool, let's take care of this fill first. Looks like some of these cuts are done pretty well. Let's see what we get if we just select a 16th note grid and quantize. Ooh, we may be getting lucky. Yeah. So this guy got pulled a little bit too forward. Sometimes Cubase will do that on the very first hit for some reason. And we're just gonna look for if any of those hit points were off. This one was just missed, so we'll go ahead and add it in along with this guy. Let's see. Great. Okay, this hi-hat has to go on the downbeat, so we're gonna start with that and work our way through this one bit at a time. What we may do is start focusing on the snare drums and then see what adjustments we might have to make for the hi-hats. So as you can see, I'm dragging the snare drums to the 16th note upbeats. And he's kind of sliding all over the place, which for these is not uncommon. Before we get too far, let's go ahead and listen ahead and make sure we know exactly when our beat switches, because it's not going to be super apparent looking at the waveforms. Okay, so it's just for these last 4. You know what I'm going to do? Going to make a new audio track that I call drum notes. Gonna drag it up here, right outside of our edit group, but where I can see it, and color it yellow. And for right now, just to give myself a little cue, I'm just gonna drag events. So I'm holding Alt, and I'm just creating empty events over these spots. So I know when I get to this yellow bar, snares need to go on the downbeat, not the upbeat. There's one more section coming up. All right. If I'm not aware of those spots, it's easy to get lost when you're kind of hyper zoomed in and you're dealing with snares on upbeats versus downbeats and hi-hats. So kind of just being aware of that and watching out for myself, for my future self. Okay, where were we? Yeah, see, he's kind of slid to not really being so much of an upbeat at this point already. I'm actually going to kind of like take a look at all of them together. And at some point, I may just scoot them all to make it easier for myself as I move along. You guys having fun? Do you wish you could be editing these drums? I wish you could be editing these drums too instead of me. But you know, it kind of goes with the territory. It is one of the least fun parts of recording death metal, especially specifically tech death, is taking care of these freaking drums. All right, so we're to the point now. This is a tricky spot because most drummers would smooth their way over from an upbeat to a downbeat. Otherwise, they're hitting like two really close together right when that switch happens. So preemptively, what I might do is just kind of make this hit like a little bit early, so it maybe doesn't sound quite so insane when he switches to these downbeats. And then we're gonna have some cymbals here that I know we're gonna wanna get on point. And then start again with this hi-hat on, and let's do what we did before and kind of drag a large chunk on the upbeat. Okay, almost there. Okay, so we have a larger chunk here. He actually left himself a bit of a gap when he transitioned to this downbeat blast. So these last few hits, we can just grab, go back to eighth notes, and pull right into place. We have this last fill to do, but let's go ahead and listen and see where we're at here. Okay, so where he switches to the downbeat blast right here still sounds a little weird. But we're gonna leave it for now until we get our crossfades going, and then adjust that, you know, however we can to make it sound more natural. Let's finish this last fill. It's not gonna take too long, right? 16th notes, quantize. How close did we get? Yeah, pretty close. Just a couple of missed hit points. Bring him over. This guy too, go down, check him out there. Looks like those got pulled together. It's about there, but maybe bring it back a bit. Hopefully you guys are kind of following along and seeing how I'm just like foreseeing a problem with the crossfades and kind of trying to take care of it by kind of going halfway in between. But let's see what we got. Quantized panel, crossfade. All right, so there's some funkiness in this hi-hat. In this particular case, there's not really much you're gonna be able to do about that. I do know from experience that that kind of stuff is going to be able to kind of be glossed over in the context of a full mix. And you know, on the flip side of that, you could probably listen to a lot of tech death albums that you know and love and find parts like this, specifically in the band that doesn't have like a top tier drummer that's just playing everything perfect. This guy's clearly no chump, but there's a few elements of his performance that are not perfect. So we're dealing with what we have, right? Okay, so let's see if there are any options we have for this part. What if we just tried to pull back and almost like remove that last snare hit? You know, it doesn't sound great. We just lose too much cymbal energy. So let's go back to actually putting it right on the money and see if maybe that sounds better in this case. You know, that's probably closer to the intention of the drummer. Still doesn't sound great to me, but we're gonna keep on moving forward, get kicks in there, and then, you know, maybe it will kind of fall into place for us. So otherwise, you know, there's one cymbal thing we just need to adjust. Right there. Sometimes you just move the crossfade and it'll sound better. Actually going to try and do right now is grab the chunk of this performance where he kind of left himself a gap between the switch from a split foot to a bomb blast, and see if we can drag it over and have it sound any better. Maybe the easier way to do that is just to go ahead and bounce these parts right now, get less cuts to worry about, and then give this a shot. Kind of play with our ends here. Maybe like that. Let's see. That sounds a lot better. Much more natural. Cool, I like it. Okay. Now, we still have no kick drums. We have some pretty tight sounding top half of the kit. We have to deal with the kick drums. So since these are, I already have an instance of trigger set up, we're going to quickly convert these audio spikes to MIDI. So I'm gonna kind of gloss over this section for the time being, but we will cover this in more depth later in the course. So for now, just you can kind of basically start wrapping your head around it, and we'll go from there. So I have this set up, triggering okay for now. I'm gonna go into settings, turn MIDI out on C1 is fine for me. Let's go ahead and make a MIDI track. We'll call this drum MIDI kick. Add track, and there it is. We'll leave it outside of this group for right now. We're gonna set its output to not connected. We're gonna set its input to the output of that instance of trigger. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn on a drum map, which we'll just go with GM map for right now. Hit record. Let's test to make sure we're getting signal. We are. So this is a real-time process. So I am going to go ahead and start this recording, and then Nick is going to do a real cool cut, and we're going to be right back, and we'll magically have MIDI that lines up with our trigger audio. So here we go. Okay, and we're back. We now have MIDI notes that correlate exactly to these kick triggers down below. I have done a few things. I just loaded up a custom drum map that I have that kind of pertains to the notes that I typically use for kick and snare, MIDI notes, and so forth. And I have created a new audio track entitled Kick Sample, and on that track is an instance of trigger with our same sample loaded on, same sample right there, and MIDI in is engaged, set to the same note that kick drum is on our MIDI map, C1. So you can see I've selected kick sample as my output for this track. If I click over here, we're triggering this sample. So at this point, our kick trig is no longer in effect. I'm gonna go ahead and disable that track. Not paying attention to that anymore. Our kicks are now completely samples being controlled by this MIDI. So this next part's pretty easy. We know that these are supposed to be 16th notes. I'm going to go ahead and grab all of these and quantize them. You see that we have some issues here. Actually, let's take a step back. We're going to open up our quantize panel, turn off iterative quantize. So we may end up building some randomization into these MIDI notes later, but for now, we're going to stick with a completely perfect set of 16th notes, go right on top of the snare, and then we can adjust that as much as we need at a later point, probably really when we get into the mix or before we send out for a mix or something like that if you're not mixing the project. So I'm going to turn off iterative quantize and grab this entire chunk and hit Q. So one thing we have to watch out for is that at this point, it's possibly moving notes on top of each other, and it's not super apparent. If you look extremely carefully, you can see there's like 2 velocities. So at this point, you go up to MIDI and around here somewhere, I believe in function, is delete doubles. So I have a custom key command set up for like a batch command in Cubase that does both of those things. It quantizes and then deletes doubles. So I know that I don't have any doubles. That's the main reason why we're turning off iterative quantize, because otherwise all those doubles won't go to the exact same spot and there's no easy way to remove them. It's a lot of like searching by hand. And I don't want to deal with that. So at this point we have a few gaps, and we're just going to click on the first spot where there's a gap. Hold down Alt, which will turn into an Add MIDI note icon. And as soon as we hit the first one, we can just drag across, and it will only add notes where there is a missing note. And let's go all the way right before this downbeat and see what that sounds like. Sounds great. Maybe a little robotic, but like I said, we can build back in some of that randomization later. One reason why, rather than just drawing all these in, I prefer to actually convert that original performance and then just quantize, is then you still end up with a little bit of kind of random velocity information, which can just help you rather than having just all the exact same volume, same sample being played. So let's move over to our next spot and take care of this alternating blast section. So a little bit more of a mess here, but let's see what we got. I'm going to go ahead and just grab it all and do the same set: quantize, MIDI, functions, delete doubles. And we're going to tackle these downbeat bomb blasts first, because I think those are the easier sections. Okay, so that little chunk sounds good. This little chunk, we're going to add a note there. Cool. Now, the rest of the stuff is enough of a mess that I think we're just going to draw them in. You know what? What happens if we just go to eighth notes and just suck them into place? They're going straight to downbeats, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Same thing. We can right-click here, and no, it doesn't actually give us this option anymore. Functions, delete doubles. Grab these, quantize, MIDI, function, delete doubles. Let's see what we got. All right, this guy can go away. Missing one on the downbeat there. We can remove one or two of these. From his snare pattern, he rests on the snare there. So let's see what happens if we open all that up. We need one more. I think we're good to go. Some of this stuff is kind of adjust to taste, you know, if you'd rather him ride through this section, then add that in there. Sounds also fine. You can go through that stuff with the drummer, or depending on what the guitars and bass and rest of the song is doing, take care of it that way. But at this point, we have 2 sections with kick drums and edited top half of the drum kit.